business of mixing branding with social movements is booming. Powerful corporations are campaigning for social equality and youth democracy through slick design and perceptive marketing. The world's top sportswear manufacturer is motivating a diverse audience to show them what crazy can do, while a razor blade supplier is demanding men to take a second look in the mirror. But what baggage or benefits do commercial interests bring to the table when mixed with serious activist conversations? And who benefits? Working with woke-washed brands can send designers and creatives into an ethical dilemma. Hi everyone, and welcome to Colloquia Sundays. I'm Paula Hardy. This session, our fifth session, All Power to All the Brands, saw Brisbane designers and community share stories around the rising trend of woke-washed branding. The session took place on Turrbal and Yuggera Land at Joseph Mark's studio on Sunday the 2nd of June. Our moderator Rachael Sarra is an artist and designer from Gureng country. She uses art as a powerful tool in storytelling to educate and share Aboriginal culture and its continuing evolution. Our panel includes Dr. David Sargent, a lecturer in visual communication design at Griffith University and creative director of Liveworm Studio at the Queensland College of Art. He's joined by Jenna, a queer mixed-race Larrakia, Waterman and Karijari artist exploring identity, language, label and object, and senior designer at Galimba, a creative agency in Brisbane. And lastly, Jordan McGuire, aka MC Synergy, joins us as a hip-hop artist, graphic designer and member of the internationally renowned design studio In Cahoots, where he works on a wide range of projects that explore the intersection of design, art and activism. Here's David Sargent in conversation with our moderator Rachael Sarra, speaking about the movement of brands towards a social good narrative.
To me, like the situation at the moment where you find brands moving into positions, so they don't only brand themselves and they don't even have products and services to sell. They're very sort of consciously, having a position which is, I think, relatively new. And I kind of go back a little bit and sort of see that as, I guess, a progression or evolution of how branding has sort of influenced the world over the last 30 years. And it's kind of like, I always like to think of it as an arms race, so like a really furious competition. And if you sort of think back, Levi's a good example, so Levi jeans, have been around for over 100 years. Originally they were built solid and tough, and people, farmers and miners and whatever, bought them because they were, the best sort of wearing pants. And then over time, they became popular with different sort of cultures and counterculture people. That's a horrible word to say. But anyway, so that their sort of perception changed, and then everything went fine for them until the 80s. When competition started to occur, and they found they were being outpriced by jeans which were made overseas, so Levi's always made in America. And what they realised is that they sort of dislocated their product from and marketing. So what they spent all their money on marketing to sell the perception of made in America and tough, and then they closed all their factories and sort of got them done by subcontractors overseas. So I think that was sort of a beginning of a real shift. And then when organisations like that do that, their competition looks at them and go, well, they're doing really well, and we're sort of burdened with this manufacturing arm, so we can sort of get rid of that. And that sort of kicks off, and everyone competes, and like I said, like an arms race. And then that has moved through lots of different organisations and factors. So service branding, universities, where everyone sort of tries to one up on each other. Mm-hmm. And then that sort of has continued along as we go. And I think now what we're seeing is brands are starting to move into this area, and then all other brands are starting to think, holy shit, like this brand has got a really clear position on this particular thing. and it's something that other brands are now trying to copy and sort of compete with.
Yeah. So you're saying that brand activism is shifting towards more of that woke washing aspect?
Oh, well, that's another factor that's coming into it. So I think some brands are, for want of a better word, that some brands are doing it better than others. So Pepsi is an example of someone who's doing it really badly, where they had that ad,
Kendall Jenner.
You know all the young so they sort of tried to get on that, but they just failed really badly. And I think other organisations, we're going to talk about Nike later on, are kind of doing it better, and I say that in quotation because it's contentious, but I think they seem to be avoiding that sort of whitewashing label, whereas other ones are really sort of hitting it hard.
Yeah. And Jordan, let's talk about branding in general, where it's come from and why it exists today. In Cahoots did the brand identity for Food Connect and Wandering Cooks, 2 Brisbane food hubs. Are there exceptions to In Cahoots' anti-branding ethos?
You mentioned before the phrase brand activism, and that struck me as an oxymoron, and we see that branding is in stark contrast to any attempts to instigate structural change. So at In Cahoots, we see visual culture and visual language as a key catalyst for social change, and we see corporations controlling the conversation on activism as a way of deflecting any real calls for structural change. So we do not work in the corporate sector. We work exclusively in the cultural and non-profit and community sector. So when we see the baggage of the corporate sector coming over to those traditionally resistant sectors, we see lots of problems. And we have organisations which are taking on ideas which do not suit their aims. So what happens is branding comes in and undermines the actual cause. So they're campaigning on the ground level, often just very directly for change in their community. And they're being sort of redirected by a brand ethos which does not suit the humanistic complexities of their organisation. So in Cahoots, we define very starkly between branding and visual identity. Branding is the ideology, visual identity is the tool and the systems of the actual visual language. So we reject any notions of branding entirely.
And Jenna, so your independent creative practice addresses intersects between culture and identity, and I know we've spoken a lot about this subject. But particularly your own ancestral cultural practice and racial identity. At the same time, you and I have also worked as creatives in the commercial world, and particularly in the Indigenous area of commercial worlds. So at the same time, you and I have both kind of collaborated with corporate clients on reconciliation action plans and also reconciliation in general between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and wider Australian communities. So this kind of work, we might say, falls under the umbrella of corporate social responsibility. I guess as a creative and even just a human being navigating cultural projects in both commercial world and your own practice, which area of practice affords you the greater ability to change based on your values?
Awesome. So I guess before I start, I'll just mention what a reconciliation action plan is. If you don't know, reconciliation action plan is exactly what it says. It's a targeted action plan to work towards reconciliation. It's essentially a document that a government agency, corporate sector, not-for-profit, literally any organisation can have, and it highlights their reason and aim for working towards reconciliation. And then towards the back of the document is a table or multiple tables which provide targets and dates and people who are responsible. So it's actually a measurable and trackable guide for reconciliation, which even that is an interesting idea, the act of reconciliation. So that is our bread and butter, essentially working in this commercial space where we represent culture and get paid for it by corporate and government clients. So there's a lot of kind of overlapping complexities, whether our personal opinion is that we want to work towards reconciliation, or if we want to work towards something like treaty or self-determination is a whole nother very complex conversation. But what we find increasingly is that clients want a branded piece of artwork to represent their reconciliation action journey. And I do say the word branded because it tells the story of that company and their goal for reconciliation through a piece of artwork. And again, these have some overlapping complexities, which I personally have a few opinions. One of them is that... Yeah. How long have you guys got? No. One of them is that these are actually can be really positive tools for change. I think artwork provides a really powerful opportunity for conversations. We need to not be in this imaginary world, though, about those conversations. I think the power of a reconciliation action plan is corporate change, and I actually believe that these artworks and plans affect staff and the company more than they will ever affect grassroots community level. I always, my personal opinion is that we as Aboriginal people out in the world don't care if you have a reconciliation action plan. We care what you do. We don't care what you say you're going to do. We care what you do. And so that they can be an interesting space to work in as an Aboriginal person on the inside and the outside, if that makes sense. But again, they can be really powerful, wonderful documents if done right. And my most successful project to be involved at Galimba, where I work, it's been the Queensland Police Service, and they have a very, very complicated history with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to say the least. But they actually commissioned a piece of artwork which was not for their reconciliation action plan. It was an artwork with the express purpose of having conversations and acknowledging that dark history. And I actually think that that's why it's been so successful. It's not linked to, and if you are interested, you can go onto Reconciliation Australia and look at every company who has a plan. It's you have to make it public, and there are names next to every target and dates, and so you can actually keep track. And they are quite interesting, and some companies do them wonderfully. Some
of it's just tick a box.
Yeah, some is very much that tick a box, and it's actually compulsory for government agencies to have one. When it becomes compulsory, it's definitely but just to say that my personal art practice, which is completely different, to summarise, is a form of self-care. It sprung out of feeling really conflicted about corporate work, and again, I personal opinion is that the work we do is really important, and it's really important it's done by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and so it's more taking back control over what I want to say and producing it in that way.
Yeah. David, since we're all alumni of QCA, I want to speak about design education. You're convening the graphic design and communication major, which I think we are all majored in, didn't we? Yeah. So of which branding is taught to students. Research shows that millennials are a relatively progressive generation. Many of us support social causes and climate justice. I'm curious about how tertiary design education has shifted to incorporate ethics and social responsibility. So how are students responding to this sort of content, and are they critical of the power of branding?
Yeah, I think it needs to be said that QCA, Queensland College of Art, is also part of Griffith University, which is, in relative terms, quite progressive in areas of ethics and social change. The university has the highest sort of percentage of first and family, like me, university students, which I think is really important. We always got to be really careful when we talk about millennials, because I'm not a millennial, and so I need to tread lightly. And then I know that there's past students and also current students in the audience, so I've got to tread maybe even lighter. I think I have seen, so I've been teaching for 10 years now, and I have seen some shifts in how sort of students present at university, sort of how they arrive, and what they do and what they're interested in, and what they are aiming to do. But I also think that this is kind of like another topic which you could talk all day about, or I could, about universities and sort of how they're already compromised by branding and marketing, marketing in particular, in that students sort of come in and a lot of them are sold a particular image which they've decided, oh, that's going to be me. For design, it's very sexy. At the moment, we're doing a lot of 3D printing photos and people working in spaces with post-it notes and things that designers do, and the images are always like, I have a lot of issues with the images that Griffith University uses, and I've had arguments which I've lost, but they're very controlled on the way that they present our degree, and I think that has an impact on who it attracts. So I find that our cohorts are very mixed. Some will come in and they come in because they've seen design as a way that they can make change. Others have come in because they sort of perhaps seem to want to have that lifestyle of being a designer. And it's not really even that lifestyle, like it's the lifestyle that they've seen in what we've presented them. So I think
the fancy ones where they can afford things.
Yeah. And then at the end, then we tell them the bad news on the last day. But I actually find it really interesting, and I think it is because people are millennials, and they sort of are born into this world that we exist in now, this brand world, and I think a vast majority are very uncritical of that, because they don't know any alternative. And I've also found that some people are very hostile to anything other than the messages that they sort of believe when they come in, whereas other students are very receptive.
Yeah. And so do you think the curriculum allows for them to push kind of their own sort of rebel against certain things, or you mentioned it is quite structured?
Yeah, in the way that we teach branding is we try to sort of be as open as we can in terms of perhaps the direction that a lot of them are going to head is that they're going to be working in a branding industry, in the branding industry, but also sort of, I guess, forewarn them of the impacts of that, and the impacts that they already sort of exist under, and let them decide what they sort of feel about that. And I think the way that is received is mixed.
Yeah. Okay.
If you don't mind, I might address this topic of education and branding. So we live in really urgent times at the moment. We're experiencing unprecedented levels of extinction all over the world. The dominant culture is creating conditions on this planet which is destroying life, and we have an immense responsibility as citizens to redirect that. So I see the dominant culture as destroying life on this planet, and then I see branding as a tool of the dominant culture to further those goals. So by concealing the conflict and destruction which are inherent in that. So I see education as a way of preparing people to redirect that harmful effect. To the extent by which we're blind to the harmful effects of branding is the extent to which we are at its whims. So the role of education, in my estimation, is to wake people up to those manipulations and the normalization of something that is actually affecting physical reality, the intangible affecting the tangible. So I was lucky to go through QCA at a time when there was some big changes happening. The Design Futures was coming in. Oliver Vodeb was course convener at the time, sociologist and designer. And for myself, I was probably uncritical coming in, but I was woken up to these ideas through education, which is, what is the role of education if not to wake you up and make you more adept at dealing with reality? So I feel like my position is that we should reject any teaching of branding in in universities. There's a movement in the States to shift away from neoclassical economics teaching because it's based on this false premise that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. Economics based on that premise is always going to lead to the results that we're seeing. So if branding is the equivalent of that, then we need to not teach it in a way that even promotes its effects. We need to be teaching it in a way that makes us aware of its harmful effects, like the way we teach World War II in schools and history class. So there's that, and just the second part of your question is about how these brands use sort of these progressive ideas to then appeal to the customer. Look, to me, that's just appealing to our idealism. The brands are always going to mirror what we believe is important. In order to get us to cop up and buy their product, they need to convince us that they are as switched on as we want to be. So it's just the equivalent of virtue signaling for a brand. They are allowing their idea that they are switched on and conscious to co-opt and allow people to make decisions or coerce people into making decisions that they feel are progressive, and really it's just reinforcing the old structural model. So I believe we need some radical shifts to happen given the urgency. It's extremely urgent, and we need as many creative minds as we can to solve these problems, to think of alternatives, to create cultures of resistance. And that's what excites me. Branding is just status quo preserving. It doesn't excite me at all. It's completely, it should be thrown out and then completely restructured in its educational form.
Yeah. And I guess from an Indigenous perspective, we have musicians and artists who are really starting to uncover some themes of Australia. So Briggs and the AB original album, and you mentioned you're an MC. Does your music practice help kind of promote that change and that shift in? Yeah. So
I see all kinds of media is important to, like, you need everything. You need design, you need music, you need poetry, you need art. So as a culture of resistance. So things that inspire people. We don't just need these change.org didactic appeals to our conscience. We need things that inspire our hearts and minds to do something active.
Yeah.
So for me, music is another avenue of interpreting it. On a personal level, it's how I digest all the complexities and problems of the world, and then integrate that on a personal level. So it's far more personal than my design practice, which is about sort of collective, collaborative effort to further and amplify positive messages and organisations.
Yeah.
So your music's an extension of that, but on a more personal level.
Yeah. And Jenna, so you and I have travelled a really similar career path. We've worked with community and clients on, cultural projects. So in my practice, I collaborate with a lot of artists as well as work for myself. But I found my whole being as an artist is to promote and share awareness of Aboriginal culture and its evolution. So I personally feel like, there's been little that's been done in a corporate or government sector that's kind of there to progress Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so my practice has not only kind of created a livelihood for myself, but it's also activated a platform for us to bring awareness to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and culture. And so the use of collaborating with brands has been pivotal on so many levels in that aspect. But I feel like all four of us have a component of our practice that helps us grapple, with the role of design and on a more critical level. For you, Jenna, would you say, it's your art and working with creators?
Yeah, I think I need to make one point is that I am strongly in support of any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander person who makes a living from our culture. I think every time I have to collaborate with a client for money and essentially culture becomes the commodity, it's really kind of soul tearing. You don't know how to deal with that, and then I kind of stop and think about my dad and my grandma and my grandfather and the fact that they were forced to not practice culture and how privileged I am to be paid to do it. I can sit down and practice my culture in a visual way, which is how I do it. Some do through music and a welcome to country ceremonies. There's many ways we can do it. But damn right I should get paid for it, because my family certainly wasn't. And a lot of what I will continue to do is make sure that any information I gather about our culture in that process is always shared back to my family. So I'm currently working with museums in the UK, accessing ancestral objects, and in that process I'm documenting it and sharing it with every single one of them, because I am so privileged to be in the position to be able to do that, that it is my responsibility to then share it. So that kind of leads me to that personal art practice. It really was trying to balance. So when I work for commercial clients, it is again a privilege to express culture and get paid for it. But you are telling their story through a medium in which they recognise as Aboriginal art and culture. And that's, everybody's on a journey when it comes to our culture, and that's fine. But the personal art practice is to counteract that. The first piece I actually made that was successful was dealing with the fact that I would walk into a room as a pale-skinned, not that culture is about skin colour, and have to almost justify who I was, where I was from. I'd need to self-identify in every meeting. So I made an artwork about that, and it was selected to be a finalist in the Telstra Award, and that's when it clicked. I'm not the only one going through this. Aboriginal people working commercially, especially in cities, we are grappling with these feelings of imposter syndrome and self-doubt and, you know, pressures to not only represent our culture accurately, but do it in a way that's following our cultural protocol, which we're still learning, because it was lost or stolen. So there's a few reasons that I really support our people earning money from practicing culture, but at the same time it's really important to have that self-care practice, because it is hard to have people feedback on your culture, which is a part of working commercially.
It's almost as if you're we have, you know, InDesign, we have Illustrator, it's almost like our cultural practice is like an extension of a program in some senses with that.
And realistically, Aboriginal people, we have always used the tools around us to produce stories. And the tools around me happen to be Illustrator, InDesign and Photoshop. So that's how I produce stories.
So Jen, can I ask you a question? To what degree do you see brands co-opting Indigenous culture, and how do you respond to that? And what's your position on brand co-option of Indigenous culture?
That's one of those. I could have a conversation, and I do have conversations with myself a lot about this, because I can see both sides to why it's positive, because corporations or government in Australia were formed on Aboriginal land and should have had Aboriginal culture considered from the beginning. They didn't, and so now we're kind of going through almost like a backtracking process. Art just happens to be one of those mediums, visual art, that people can connect to. Some brands do it really wonderfully and proudly, and I think it's so complicated. Some, you know, like again to mention the Queensland Police Service, that's a problematic brand to work with, but what they've done with it has produced really positive change working across the state, and so something like that can be done well, and other brands, sure, it's a token, but.
And I think the interesting thing about Queensland Police is there has been a lot of trauma caused by the police service across the world. But the unique thing about Queensland Police, where they weren't shying away from that, they wanted to acknowledge that as part of the past, and being able to acknowledge that is also that extension of being able to heal from it, so not shying away from it. So it's kind of that sense of, you know, activating a reality and authenticity of not just covering it up and acting like it wasn't there.
And we could probably do a thesis on this, and maybe I will. But
Dr. Generally,
it's going to happen. But yeah, I don't know the answers. It's a really new space as well. Like, brands in Australia have only been doing this for, how long have we been working? 5-6 years, so maybe 10 years. for me, that's quite a new space. So I don't know yet. Maybe in 20 years' time, Aboriginal art will be everywhere, and it will be beautiful, and it will be just a part of everything. But then at the same time, it can be that brand using that artwork for gain.
What's your worst case scenario and best case scenario?
Oh, my worst case scenario probably already happens, where Aboriginal culture is not included, or if it is, it's come out of Bali. So it's kind of already a reality in Australia. I mean, it's changing, but the fact that there are still souvenir stores in Queen Street that sell absolutely 100% fake Aboriginal art in a city with artists, and so that to me is my worst case scenario, which is it's current. And that fake art harms culture campaign, you should definitely have a look at that, and the purchasing and commissioning of ethical Indigenous art is really important as well. And that's where potentially our role in that, because there are companies who go on Shutterstock and get the Aboriginal art.
I think that's a real crisis in terms of how young people are exposed to images of other people that they aspire to, which are very unrealistic, manufactured, and I think harmful in a lot of ways. And I've seen that with the way that students are, and the way that they compare themselves to these sort of expectations. And it doesn't just go through, I think, images and body image. That seems to sort of permeate through everything. So students these days, I think, are really anxious about everything in their life, and I think a lot of that comes from external pressures. So social media is another aspect of that, where everyone is sort of exposed to everyone's perfect branding of themselves, and how they then stack up to that, causes that anxiety, and that comes through everything. So anxiety for what they're going to do after they graduate. They're going to get a job, they're going to get a house, constantly being told, no, you're probably never going to own a house if you wanted to do that. Constantly being told, full-time positions don't really exist so much anymore, and you're going to be, the new gig economy is going to be your reality. Climate change and all those sort of issues that I think sort of really impact on people like that.
That was David Sargent, Jenna Lee and Jordan McGuire in conversation with Rachael Sarra at Colloquia Sundays, all power to all the brands. Thank you for listening, and big thanks to all who helped organise the session, including our panel, Colloquia Sundays co-designer Lucy Matthews, the team at Joseph Mark, and the community, designers and students who attended the session. If you want to attend our next Sunday session, keep an eye out on Colloquia Sundays' social media channels, or send us an email at colloquiasundays@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Paula Hardy. Until next time.